Hello, I am lead developer Philip Victor and I'd like to welcome you to Half-Life 2 update and its brand new community commentary mode. This latest version of the update was certainly the most ambitious version yet and has taken 3 years of development to get it just right. My goal is to create an experience where long-time fans can replay the game they love in a new and improved form, and first-time players can have an experience that's closer to modern visual and technical standards while also maintaining and respecting the 2004's original sensibilities, gameplay, and concepts. This community commentary feature aims to provide information not mainly on the development of the update itself, but on the development of the original Half-Life 2 using research and community input. To listen to a commentary node, put your crosshair over the floating commentary symbol and press your use key. To stop a commentary node, put your crosshair over the rotating node and press the use key again. Consider joining the official Steam group to give me your impression and suggestions and stay on top of Half-Life 2 updates news. Thanks and have fun!
We opted to label this as a community commentary as opposed to developer commentary for several reasons. First and foremost, we were not developers that worked on any official release of Half-Life 2, but also because we want to approach this commentary not as a developer, but as fans of the game. I was responsible for creating most of the commentary, with the help of several other Half-Life fans and members of our Steam group. Any nodes pertaining to the development of the update will be read by Victor and myself, and any nodes with facts and insight into the original Half-Life 2 and its development will be read by Ross Scott and our friends from Did You Know Gaming. Many people pitched in a lot of time and energy to make this happen, and I hope it will be something you enjoy. Thanks.
This train station is our first introduction to City 17 and the world of Half-Life 2. Valve's level designers had to carefully craft every aspect of this scene to convey its oppressive atmosphere. This sort of environmental storytelling was something that Valve pioneered back in the days of Half-Life 1, and it allowed them to flesh out a setting without ever taking control away from the player. One advantage of Half-Life 2's approach when compared to Half-Life 1's opening train ride sequence is that players can explore at their own pace and learn a lot of additional information by interacting with the characters. All of these techniques are key parts of maintaining the player's sense of immersion and are quite prevalent throughout the first few chapters of the game.
This first sighting of a Vortigaunt serves 2 purposes. It's a reminder of the events of Half-Life 1, and it's a sign of how the situation has changed since the Black Mesa incident. A member of a race who was once a foe for the player now complacently sweeps a station platform while a civil protection officer hovers nearby. The Vortigaunt's subservient posture and lack of hostility towards the player is one of the first indications that the human and Vortigaunt races have met a similar fate.
You have chosen or been chosen to relocate.
This sequence clearly illustrates the division of humanity into loyalists and lower middle-class individuals. The contrast between the faceless metro cops who have traded away their humanity for power and the terrified citizens clinging to their few remaining shreds of normality shows the relationship between the 2 factions perfectly.
You have chosen or been
Something that is made evident over the course of the game is the Combine's treatment of Earth and everyone on it as commodities, shipping people from one place to another and harvesting them with only token regard for how their loss affects anything else. The Citizens' prison-style uniforms are some of the first indications of this, though the theme is reinforced later by the Combine's use of part biological, part mechanical synths from their previous conquests.
Barney and Dr. Kleiner were developed from the generic scientists and security guards of Half-Life 1. The entire supporting cast of the original Half-Life consisted of only a few voice actors and character models, so Valve decided to distill the characteristics of those NPCs into fully developed, fleshed-out individuals for Half-Life 2. The state-of-the-art facial animations and detailed visuals of the Source engine gave Valve great tools to tell stories of a much more personal nature, and they've used these tools to create a core cast of iconic characters that lend far more weight to the storyline.
The infamous "pick up that can" segment serves a dual purpose. It puts the player in the place of one of this world's downtrodden civilians, while also teaching the player how to interact with this world he or she is now a part of. As this was one of the first games to pioneer fully interactive physics-based worlds, players were shocked not only because they were asked to pick up the can, but because they could. Actions speak louder than words, and because the encounter takes place solely within the mechanics of the game, the player is free to respond exactly how he or she chooses, and can roleplay Gordon in a more meaningful way than with a dialogue option. This moment has become an enormous inside joke with the Half-Life community, spawning many parodies and references.
Breen's speeches demonstrate some of the game's most interesting characterization because they provide not only his motivations and some local news, but they also portray the internal conflict that's central to his character. It's clear from the rehearsed and detached sound in his voice that he's likely to have put a lot of mental effort into justifying his decision to sell humanity into eternal servitude and conformity. His lofty, transhumanist rhetoric often seems to be as much to convince himself as it is to the citizens that he addresses.
This is the player's first view of the outside world, and the Citadel is what will immediately draw the player's attention. Since it is first viewed while aligned with the Breencast monitor atop the obelisk, it is easy for the two to be instantly connected in the player's mind. The Citadel's gigantic size not only shows the Combine's immense power, but also allows the player to see it from many locations throughout the game, anchoring the player within the world and building it up as the location for the final struggle.
When designing Half-Life 2, the team at Valve decided on an Eastern European setting and wanted City 17 to appear to have grown naturally over time like most cities in Europe. To achieve this realistic look, they started by first designing the older buildings and then added in layers of newer and newer buildings from different eras. Finally, they added the Combine architecture, for example the barricades, catwalks, watchtowers, and of course the Citadel, to show that the Combine are now a part of the city's history.
Several times throughout this commentary, there are references to Half-Life 2's realistic look. Those familiar with Half-Life 2 will know it is, in fact, quite stylized, so I'd like to explain what this means. Half-Life 2 is based on our world, and it tries very much to have a good sense of realism, something it carries over from its predecessor. Guns and items don't hover, rotating in midair, characters have realistic proportions, and much of the in-game architecture is based off of or inspired by real-world buildings. Half-Life 2 is stylized, but it has a bent towards presenting its world in a realistic way, and that's the issue we are discussing.
In early versions of Half-Life 2, views of citizen life were restricted to minor window glimpses. The development team had plans for a rooftop segment, but had no existing designs for getting the player up there from the courtyards and streets. By adding in the apartment building, players were then able to interact with the citizens who would not speak to them on the streets, and gain further insight as to how citizens live under Combine law.
The televised Breencasts inside citizens' homes revealed the extent to which the Combine's propaganda has intruded into every aspect of the citizens' lives, contributing to the dystopian, prison-like feel of City 17. The very simple act of allowing players to unplug the TV and fling it out a window lets these players express some rebellion towards the Combine while showcasing Source's physics system and the freedom it offers.
Oh, I thought you were coming.
He's one of us. I can't take it anymore.
These two citizens, who are known as the sad couple or the consoling couple, show up multiple times throughout the Half-Life 2 series to illustrate the emotional impact that Combine rule has on Earth's enslaved population. Though their poses never change, their dialogue does, and it branches out into more direct exposition regarding the current events within the world. This shows the player how others react to their actions, creating the illusion that the game's world is far larger and more dynamic than the current map being played.
The apartment block raid was added later into the game's development, and Valve was initially worried that players would not feel compelled to run, causing the sequence to be confusing and overly difficult. When playtesting started, however, players would panic, but almost always know what to do. Upon escaping the raid through the attic, players often felt as though they had barely escaped.
Up until this point, City 17 had only been viewed by the player from the ground level. This rooftop escape provides a clear bird's-eye view of the city to greater establish the location that will become central to the rest of the game, with a nice sense of scale. The Combine air and ground forces visibly mobilizing also offers the player a brief glimpse of the stronger foes that will be confronted directly later in the game.
Dr. Freeman, I presume.
Attention.
We better hurry. The Combine can be slow to wake, but once they're up, you don't want to get in their way.
Alex Vance is a character that is central to the Half-Life 2 saga. The close-up view that the player sees after she takes out the Metro cops places her into the spotlight, setting her up as a central character while showcasing Source's revolutionary facial animation technology. To ensure that the player's attention continues to be on Alex during these introductory moments, a convenient elevator ride removes any distractions from the area as the player becomes acquainted with her. Her dialogue there and in the segments that follow provide context for her character and explains her relationships to the other characters that players have already met.
Oh, and by the way, nice to finally meet you.
During long expository scenes such as this one, Valve prefers to let the player look and walk around freely, rather than seizing player control for the cutscene. These scripted sequences are densely packed with detail and optional interactions, and the player can decide where to focus his or her attention. This method of storytelling helps to build immersion through interactivity, and allows returning players to entertain themselves with things they might have missed the last time they played.
I found him wandering around outside.
This was the first choreographed scene created for Half-Life 2, and was used as a template for similar scenes throughout the rest of the game. Scripts went through many revisions with the aid of feedback from the animators. It was important that the scenes be engaging and interesting for the players watching it, and for the animators creating it. Once the scripts were in the final stages, the lines would be recorded and turned into a radio play. These scenes needed to convince players that the world and characters in it were real and tangible. This was accomplished through visible, physical interactions between different characters, and between the characters and their environment. A handshake or hug between characters, or having someone pick up an in-world object and present it to the player, went a long way toward making Half-Life 2's world appear tangible.
We owe a great deal to Dr. Freeman, even if trouble does tend to follow in his wake.
Those who had played the first Half-Life were very impressed with the sparse and primitive dramatic scenes within the game. This positive response inspired Valve to push the boundaries of in-game dramatics in Half-Life 2. In order for the game's characters to be compelling, they needed to have realistic and expressive faces. After trying to achieve this via several methods, and being unhappy with the results, they stumbled upon the work of Dr. Paul Ekman, who wanted a clinical way to describe overall facial expressions. He accomplished this by breaking the range of facial expressions down into 40 or so small facial adjustments, like the raising of an eyebrow or the puckering of the lips. By understanding how these adjustments combined together and affected each other to form expressions, a system could be formed that would recreate these small adjustments on a computer-generated face, achieving the realistic and expressive faces that are a hallmark of Half-Life 2.
Power armor is common among first-person shooters. Its primary purpose is to provide an in-world explanation for important gameplay elements, like why the player can take so many bullets and the existence of a heads-up display. The HEV suit in particular is useful as it alerts the player of environmental hazards, as well as the current status of Gordon's health. Half-Life 2's HEV Mark V appears to be composed mostly of a Kevlar or chainmail-like material, which seems far more realistic than Half-Life 1's rigid and metallic design for the Mark IV. In fact, the Mark V was to be much more flexible, resembling a leather torture suit. However, this was inevitably scrapped, presumably due to a more familiar design that was faithful to the original game.
The teleport sequence you just witnessed served several purposes. It effectively separates Alex and Gordon, alerts Dr. Breen and the Combine of your return as a viable threat, and sets the player off on their journey with a clear goal in mind: reach Black Mesa East. Several instances of content otherwise cut from the game can also be spotted in this scene, such as the barren, sandy wastelands and the ichthyosaur.
Here, Gordon Freeman is reunited with his iconic crowbar. Having a commonplace tool as the initial weapon of the Half-Life games helps establish Gordon as an ordinary person being thrust into extraordinary circumstances. It also helps to reinforce the fact that while the series is full of outlandish sci-fi elements, it still has its basis in the real world.
During development, many different animations were attempted for the civil protection officers. However, many of the various attempts didn't seem to fit them very well. It was then decided to give them a bullying personality by putting a touch of swagger in their step and having them lead with their chest as they walk. They also let their stun batons do the talking, so they always have one in hand. These small hints through body language are why players can recognize a Metro Cop's personality without much in the way of facial or vocal cues.
Vortigoths are one of the few alien species to make the jump from Half-Life 1 into the world of Half-Life 2. Unlike barnacles and headcrabs, however, they are now allies of the player, who had freed their race with the defeat of the Nihilith. They now lend their mastery of electrical energy to the forces of the rebellion. They fight for their freedom in hopes of not returning to their history of servitude.
Guess those sirens are for you, huh? Good thing you found us. You're not the first to come through here by
This is the Freeman. The Combine's reckoning has come.
Look, we're just a lookout for the Underground Railroad. Main station's right around the corner. They'll get you started on the right foot. Meanwhile, let my Vortigaunt friend here give you a jolt to get you going.
That is all we can spare.
Be careful now. We really can't afford to get noticed. Civil protection catches you down here, it's bad news for the whole railroad.
We serve the same history.
Citizen reminder.
The canals are populated with many small but dense and frequent details. This design choice allows for details within details. Anything from some ammo to a zombie to a skull in the mud can be hidden there, rewarding exploration and adding richness to the world.
Valve tries to stay fresh by bucking certain trends and doing things in their own unique and original style. Part of their inspiration for doing so was a gaming journalism site named Old Man Murray, which would often review games based on their originality and make fun of games that they felt lacked it. One cliché Valve tried to avoid was the first-person shooter trend of having crates and boxes strewn across its environments. However, after worrying about it for quite a while, they eventually gave in, as it proved to be a habit that was too hard to break. They threw themselves on the mercy of the court, and one of the first things that players will see is a crate.
Often, Valve prefers to introduce new enemies in a safe environment so that the player can observe their behavior prior to engaging them in battle. However, the Manhack's attack strategy relies on attacking a human target, which makes this difficult. Here, instead of having the player watch from afar, they are instead thrust into battle alongside a companion that they can observe. He is almost always attacked before the player, and the fact that he grabs a nearby pipe is a clear indicator that melee weapons are ideal when combating Manhack.
NPCs require a lot of resources, including textures, animations, combat AI, algorithms to move their eyes, and multiple sound files full of dialogue. All of these things have to be managed by the engine when a character is on the map, so it's good practice to remove characters after they have served their purpose so that these resources don't have to be maintained anymore. If these characters were simply deleted from the map after characters progressed past their area, most players wouldn't notice. However, if someone were to backtrack, he or she would find it to be immersion breaking to find a character suddenly missing. This is why if you were to turn back from here and go to the room where you first encountered Manhacks, you'd find the character dead with another Manhack hovering over his head. This stays within the fiction of City 17 and effectively frees up engine resources. The same happens with many other one-off characters throughout the game.
Biological weapons known as head crab canisters are used by the Combine to indirectly fight the Resistance, clearing out their bases and ensuring that they cannot be repopulated. The player was once to visit the place from where these canisters were fired, and while this was cut from the final game, it was likely the inspiration for Half-Life 2 Lost Coast. The canisters themselves are most likely a retooling of the cut enemy known as the Sack Tick. It was planned to be a macro virus that was also to be delivered in a missile-like pod. It was to be used to soften up enemy positions, weakening them prior to a Combine attack.
It's going to be tough dodging
The
civil
Resistance-built
protection out there in the
airboat
open,
marks the
but
first time in the
drive
Half-Life
hard
series
and
that the
you'll
player
make
was
it.
able to
You'll
freely
find more
pilot a
help up at
vehicle.
Station
It
7.
was originally to be
Just
a
a few
jet
bends
ski,
up the
however
river.
playtesting
It's
made
the
some
old red
obvious
barn.
flaws apparent. Driving the jet ski
Climb on
felt
in
too
and
much like
fire up.
walking, and it was often hard to tell which way the vehicle was facing relative to the player. Once it was replaced with the airboat, known around Valve as the Mudskipper, the driving style felt
Go
right,
ahead and get in the
and
boat,
the roll
Dr.
cage
Freeman.
gave the player a good reference as to the craft's orientation.
Something that made Half-Life 1 unique among its peers was the existence of allies. Most similar games of that era cast all other characters as enemies of the player, and Half-Life 1 was to be the same way. However, after some experimentation with the concept of friendly NPCs, playtesters found them helpful and endearing, and it was then decided that they should become a major component of the game. The team then wondered about creating a third NPC relationship, a group or character whose motives seemed indifferent to the player. This was the birth of the mysterious character who's known only as the G-Man. He watches the player from afar with an expressionless face, stalking players through their journeys and possibly influencing future events. He is exceptionally calm and collected when considering the events of the games he appears in. There is still much mystery surrounding him, with the only known information having been extracted from game files or decoded from riddle-like dialogue. His employers, his interest in Gordon, and his ability to stay one step ahead of the player are still unexplained.
Originally, the canals were designed in such a way that the player was speeding past enemies which were above them. However, many players would instead choose to engage these enemies, not wanting to miss any aspect of the game. In order to maintain proper pacing, the game's canals were redesigned so that each segment was focused on either driving or fighting exclusively.
Valve, unwilling to break the first-person perspective, had to fine-tune how closely the player's view was attached to the airboat to maintain a sense of realism without causing nausea. Too close and every bump jolted the screen, too far and the player wouldn't feel attached to the craft. By carefully adjusting how the player's view bobbed and tilted relative to the surrounding airboat, they were able to solve this problem while keeping the player's view within the vehicle.
Half-Life 2's Combine Hunter Chopper serves the same purpose as the HECU's AH-64 Apache from Half-Life 1. Its constant stalking of the player, along with its barrage of bullets, keeps the player dashing from cover point to cover point until provided with a weapon to take it out of the sky, satisfyingly destroying the menace that has plagued him or her for so long.
Source's physics system was, in many ways, at the core of Half-Life 2. It was one of the first times a dynamic physics simulation was used in a video game on such a large scale. It was important not only that objects would topple correctly when knocked into, or fall properly when dropped, but that each object made the appropriate sounds when hit with a crowbar or dragged along a wall. It was important that each object had an appropriate amount of weight, and would do the proper amount of damage when whipped against the player or another NPC. The goal was to make the physics system seem so natural and complete that it wasn't something that the players would even notice. It would just be part of the game's world.
This lone Vortigaunt, most widely known as the all-knowing Vortigaunt, is a prime example of Valve's affinity for Easter eggs, rewarding player exploration and optional exposition. Much like the G-Man, his messages are cryptic and up for interpretation. He strongly ties much of Half-Life 1's events to Half-Life 2, and is one of the few characters to make reference to the G-Man or the Nihilin, along with references that possibly discuss the existence of the player controlling Gordon. He is also referred to as the Sore Throat Vortigaunt or the Singing Vortigaunt.
When creating a computer program, encountering numerous bugs and glitches is unavoidable, and Half-Life 2 was no exception. However, something that makes games unique among software is that an unintentional mistake can lead to exciting new opportunities. Valve employee Brian Jacobson was programming the Hunter Chopper's bull-rushing behavior for this final fight. The chopper was supposed to rush towards the player from a distance, spraying bullets towards the ground as it went. However, instead of telling it to fire bullets, he accidentally instructed it to drop bombs, resulting in his frame rate crawling as bombs poured out of the craft. The concept was so cool, however, that it was retooled to work correctly within the game, and became a new behavior for the Hunter Chopper.
Ever since the early days of Half-Life 2's development, Eli's lab was an important location. However, as the game changed, so did the lab's setting. At different points in development, it was situated under an overturned ship, or in a man-made cave filled with hanging gardens and underground wells. One iteration more closely resembled a garage rather than a lab, and was filled with old cars and mechanics equipment. Eventually, Eli's lab found its home in the decommissioned hydroelectric power plant dubbed Black Mesa East.
I'll take you down to Eli right away. He would never forgive me if I kept you waiting.
Judith Mossman is actually a character born from the cut content of Half-Life 1. Although the voice on Half-Life 1's introductory train ride says Black Mesa is an equal opportunity employer, not a single female employee is seen in person throughout the entire game. Technical limitations at the time precluded the use of the textures needed to incorporate female scientists, which resulted in Black Mesa being inhabited entirely by males. In the concept stage, there was originally going to be a female scientist who would betray Gordon, telling him to wait in a room while she snuck off and called in guards who would attempt to capture the player. Another thing of note is the following elevator ride. While Alex's introductory elevator removed distractions, Judith's elevator adds distractions that are actually far more interesting than her dialogue. Little details like this nudge players toward liking Alex and having mixed feelings towards Mossman.
Feel free to look
The
around.
head preserved in this jar is the head of a monster cut from the game. It was a Combine janitor called the Cremator, which would clear the streets of dead soldiers and citizens' bodies after a skirmish. It was to do so using a hose that sprayed some sort of corrosive chemical. During this scene, if the player looks at this head, the newspaper clipboard, or the Vance family picture, Eli will respond, addressing whatever the player is looking at. This is one of the rare instances in the Half-Life series where the voiceless player is able to affect the dialogue in a more meaningful way than just pressing the use key. It shows that other characters are aware of your actions and that these actions are worth addressing.
Eli Vance is the Half-Life 2 counterpart of the Half-Life 1 scientist who opened an eye scanner door for the player, telling them to head for the surface right after the resonance cascade. This is evidenced by his dialogue here, the first time in Half-Life 2 where you meet him in person. During the game's complicated development, the character we now know as Eli Vance was originally two separate characters, Captain Vance and Eli Maxwell. Captain Vance was an undercover resistance member who worked for the Combine, running a facility referred to as the Air Exchange, who was also intended to be Alex's father. Eli Maxwell was a character not unlike the final version of Eli Vance. The only major differences are his relationship with Alex as a close friend rather than a father, and he had a very different appearance with a longer beard, glasses, and a cane. When the Air Exchange was cut, it took Captain Vance down with it. The two characters were then rolled into one, and the underground resistance fighter and military leader roles were given to Barney Calhoun and Odessa Cubbage, respectively. It has also been officially stated that Eli Vance lost his leg to a bull squid, a Half-Life 1 enemy that was also cut from the sequel during development. As an in-game explanation has never been provided, this is still considered to be true within the game's fiction.
Alex Vance was not a typical video game heroine at the time of Half-Life 2's release. However, this was not always the case. She originally wore a two-toned bodysuit with knee-high boots and belts with buckles. A few weeks before the E3 reveal, it was decided that she was not a unique character and that she needed to stand out from the crowd. Emergency meetings were held on weekends to try and make her fresh and different. Among the concepts that were considered were giving her glasses or braces and making her a mechanic. The final Alex we have today is a talented hacker, a fighter, and a persistent and determined individual with a kind heart who is willing to get dirty and make do in her fight for freedom.
Dr. Mossman may call it the zero-point energy field manipulator, but almost everyone else calls it the gravity gun. Valve has always made it a point to create the illusion that their worlds are tangible. This was part of the reason why Half-Life 1's crowbar visibly reacted when it struck against a wall, accompanied by the appropriate sounds and leaving a mark on the surface. The gravity gun was designed for the same purpose, allowing the player to use Source's physics system to their advantage. The gravity gun's claim to fame is its ability to pick up almost any small or medium-sized physics object and launch it into an enemy. The heavier the object, the more damage it will do. It allowed players to be creative and draw ammo or medkits to them while hiding behind cover, kill an enemy with a toilet, return a grenade to sender, or hold a radiator in front of them as a shield. Giving the player a tool like this opened up possibilities for many different types of mechanics, which heavily influenced the design and gameplay of Half-Life 2, with some of the most well-known showing up in the game's next chapter. Players' responses to the gravity gun over the years have been extremely positive, and as such it became a staple of the episodes that follow Half-Life 2, Episode 1 in particular.
Dog is a fan-favorite character, and is one of the few characters to have almost no major redesigns after his initial sketch, having essentially jumped straight from his concept art into a final in-game model with only a few recolors. He is based on classic sci-fi movie robots, like Robbie from Forbidden Planet. He is visibly made up of parts from various machines, the most recognizable being the Combine City scanner camera that serves as his
Gordon,
face.
this is Dog.
His name suits him
My
well,
dad
as his
built him to
personality,
protect me when
his
I was a kid.
vocalizations, and his
First
relationship
model
with
was
Alex all
about
display
yay
very
high.
dog-like qualities.
I've been adding to
Playing
him
fetch
ever
with him
since.
is a very fun way to
Haven't
playfully
I,
teach
boy?
the gravity gun's mechanics, while
Okay,
establishing
Dog,
his
let's
character.
play catch with Gordon.
Reyvenholm is heavily foreshadowed throughout the chapter Black Mesa East. From the moment the dark hallway is spotted and Alex cryptically remarks that they don't go there anymore, players know exactly where they're headed when this chapter closes. However, Reyvenholm was not always to be framed in this fashion. The player was originally to expect Reyvenholm to be a sanctuary away from Combine control, only to find that it had gone awry in a most unpleasing way. This idea was obviously abandoned in favor of creating a building tension as the player approached the zombie-infested town.
When designing monsters for Half-Life 2, especially those for Reyvenholm, Ted Backman preferred to create creatures that were more gross and disgusting in their appearance rather than threatening. Threatening features are commonly used in many games. However, he didn't find that approach to be terribly effective, and discovered that creatures who were revolting elicited a better response.
Many ideas that were scrapped for Half-Life 1 found new life in Half-Life 2. One of those concepts was an enemy whose attack never killed the player, but always instantly dropped their health down to 1 point. This changed the gameplay dynamics and makes other creatures in the area a more immediate threat, and therefore makes this health dropper a high priority to the player when other enemies are present. The black head crab was born. Its distinctive sound and tendency to hide causes the players to frantically search the room whenever they hear a rattle.
When designing a game, it is best to have a continuous cycle of designing and playtesting. Constantly iterating upon current designs by considering feedback is important, as it allows for the game to be tailored to the player's needs. Something that was discovered through this process was that players didn't like leading zombies to Grigori's traps as much as they liked bringing the traps to the zombies. This brought about the creation of the saw blades and explosive barrels strewn across the town, allowing players to set up traps of their own for maximum zombie carnage.
The fast zombie wasn't originally a zombie at all, but an alien assassin that was designed for a section of the game that was later cut. Not wanting to abandon its AI, they moved it from location to location, trying to find the proper habitat for its gameplay. Eventually, it found a home in Reyvenholm, and the creature's visual design was created to fit the atmosphere and the existing AI. Most of Half-Life 2's enemies were not designed in this fashion, which makes the fast zombie terrifyingly unique.
Half-Life 2 is a sound library of impressive size, with thousands of different sounds. Some were based on existing sound libraries, while others were from original recordings, or were electronically generated using synthesizers. Kelly Bailey, Half-Life 2's main sound guy, would often mix, chop up, and manipulate the raw sounds to create unique effects and vocalizations. Hunting calls were often used, including the sounds of elk, coyotes, deer, rabbits, geese, and ducks. This results in sounds that are familiar, but shockingly off at the same time.
The Combine Soldier, one of the most prevalent enemies in the game, went through many design changes. Early designs were very alien, and some concepts displayed the soldiers as worm-like creatures of the Combine race. It was later decided that the race itself should be invisible, plotting in the background, and that modified humans would instead fight for the Combine cause on Earth.
The buggy's visual design is a prime example of all citizen-built tech in Half-Life 2. Its cobbled together and war-torn design shows two things: that the Combine occupation has been long enough to preclude the acquisition of new parts, and that the rebel citizens are resilient, creative, and resourceful, making do with what they can find. Using an object's visual design to add detail to the game's history is an unobtrusive way of adding depth to the picture.
Often, the more work one puts into inserting small, natural details, the more likely it is that these efforts will go unnoticed. This is an ironic truth about production, and is related to the concept of decreasing returns. One example are the seagulls during the highway chapters. Most players spot them flying around, but few have noticed that they will perch and defecate on the buggy while the player is exploring a structure along the coast, only to fly away upon the player's return. While these details often go by happily unnoticed, they do flesh out the world of Half-Life 2 and leave a small thing for players to discover the next time they play.
In Half-Life 1, Valve wanted to give the players freedom in creating their own identity, which is why the player was able to kill friendly NPCs along with their enemies. Originally, the player could do this in Half-Life 2 as well. However, this led to several problems. First of all, it limited the kind of storytelling Valve could accomplish. Secondly, Half-Life 2's more realistic look made the characters more sympathetic, and made killing them less fun. This also created a problem on the coast levels. In order to coax the player out of the buggy, an NPC would run into the road and grab the player's attention, only to be accidentally run over.
When creating a realistic game, it is important that elements within the game's world appear as they do in the real world. Achieving a realistic look is often accomplished through the use of reference photos taken by the developers from various locations. When creating the coast for Half-Life 2, Valve took photos from aircraft carriers, shipbuilding yards, and Arctic research vessels. When creating a reference for the magnetic crane, Valve employee Laura Dubuque went to West Seattle to get photos for the crane's exterior, and used the cockpit of a bulldozer as the reference for the crane's interior.
The Combine gunship's unique gameplay actually came about from a mistake. The gunship was to aim at the player while the player fired rockets at the gunship. However, the gunship's AI decided that the rockets fired upon it were a more immediate threat, and targeted those more often than the player. This playtested so well that the gunship battles were reimagined into what they are today, a game of cat and mouse, with rockets.
When undertaking a project as large as Half-Life 2, it's impossible to work on the entire game at once, and it's important to break it down into several smaller problems. Valve decided to tackle this by dividing the Half-Life 2 development team into smaller groups called cabals. Each cabal would consist of several people with differing talents: animators, level designers, and programmers. There were 4 cabals during Half-Life 2's development, 3 of which would work on the gameplay, and would each tackle a different section of the game, such as the coast, the prison, canals, etc. The 4th would work on the cinematic scenes, working alongside the gameplay cabals to tell the story of Half-Life 2.
Here's a bit of car-related trivia. The sound for the buggy was created from a sound library and is a recording of a 1968 Camaro with a racing engine and stainless steel exhaust pipes.
In many ways, the Half-Life games are about the illusion of freedom. For example, scripted sequences replace cutscenes, but they don't actually allow the player to have any input, just as many seemingly open scenarios only have one true solution. Overall, the Half-Life games are linear, despite almost always giving the player complete control over Gordon. In order to allow players to believe they are in control and preserve this illusion, each map is filled with optional content. By adding in many side areas that the player may ignore or stumble upon, the world becomes more rich, immersive, and believable. This can be difficult, but the payoff is worth it. This kind of design is increasingly common in AAA action games, but Valve likes to have some fun with it, and the constant motif of trains can be seen as a subtle nod to how the player is going to spend the duration of the game on a predetermined path, whether they know it or not.
Throughout the development of Half-Life 2, the wilderness outside of City 17 changed many times, more so than any other concept. It was, at one time, conceived as a dried seafloor with the last drops of the ocean being drained by a teleport, and at another, it was a vast scrapyard of junked military vehicles. The one theme that stuck from the wasteland's inception to its eventual evolution into the coast, however, is the presence of the City 17 Railroad. It connects the various locations and makes them cohesive, while helping to reassure the player that they are headed in the proper direction.
One of the dilemmas when trying to create a realistic game is balancing realism with gameplay. A level with finely tuned gameplay may be disrupted during an art pass, and a level that looks realistic and believable may be sullied by a gameplay pass. The best levels, according to Valve employee David Sawyer, are levels where art passes support the gameplay and inspire it. A prime example is this bridge sequence. The art here matches the gameplay, and the gameplay here matches the art, creating a memorable and cohesive experience.
The more research one does on Half-Life 2's development, the more one will realize that a lot of content was eventually cut from the final release. However, Valve's philosophy on this is interesting. If Valve seems to be cut happy, it's only because they know that cutting one thing leaves more time for another thing to be worked on. If both things were never fully implemented or realized, the result would be two half-finished elements instead of one that is fully realized and polished. Therefore, it doesn't really matter what gets cut, because something else will certainly be made great because of it.
When creating a fictional world, in order for it to be believable to those visiting it, it's important for many things to have a sense or logic, or at least a consistency. A good example of this is the Combine's technology. All of their technology has a consistent style. Their structures are not symmetrical, and while they do contain patterns, they are not pleasant ones. Many of their structures also consist of many large boxy parts, which are put together in a way that gives everything a mass-produced, prefabricated appearance that could not be achieved without massive factories and near limitless resources.
Puzzles are key to the pacing of the Half-Life games. Puzzles force players to take their time to digest past events, prepare for future action sequences, and take in detailed environments around them. Without these puzzles, the game would become a non-stop action fest that would become quite tiresome for the player after a while. This puzzle in particular forces the player to explore this abandoned resistance base in search of car batteries, presenting them with an opportunity to notice the small details and enjoy the atmosphere.
The antlion's design was always intended to be focused on the configuration of its legs. The final design takes the unique approach of having the front legs positioned over the back legs, but farther back on the antlion's body. As one of the first creatures to be developed for the game, they were play-tested for various applications, and originally they were very tough enemies who took a lot of hits. However, it was soon discovered that it was much more fun for the players to just destroy them in droves. As a consequence of this, antlions are now enemies who are a threat in numbers, and they attack in hordes.
The behavior of the antlion guard is modeled after that of a bull, rearing its legs and charging headfirst at the player. Originally, antlion guards would hurl noxious pheropods at the player that would flush the player into open areas where the large guard has an advantage. It was later decided that this power should be given to the player instead, in order to control an antlion army.
Half-Life 2 is a reoccurring theme of foes becoming friends. The two prime examples are the Vortigaunts and the Antlions. This is also prevalent later with various forms of Combine tech used in future chapters of Half-Life 2 and in the episodes. This works well because the player has first-hand experience with the strengths and weaknesses of these enemies before they become tools and allies for the player to use.
In the first Half-Life game and its expansions, a tutorial level was included to train the player, teaching basic controls as well as familiarizing the player with various mechanics that would be used throughout the game. While developing Half-Life 2, Valve decided that this was no longer needed, and it would be preferable to instead train the player during the game's main campaign via on-screen prompts and in-game NPCs. This bug-bait training sequence with the Vortigaunt instructor is a prime example of the new system. This scene, along with the scrapyard sequence where you play fetch with dog, effectively convey the game's rules and mechanics to the player without breaking immersion.
When designing the Combine's uniform, designer Ted Bachman considered many options, then ultimately chose an unconventional look for their protective materials. It's typical for video game developers to dress their soldiers in metallic armor. However, this didn't seem appropriate for the high-tech Combine. He also decided against giving them shoulder pads, as it was a popular trend at the time that didn't really make much sense to him. Instead of following the trends of the time, he opted for a plausible design that would age well.
Gordon's journey along the coast was originally to conclude at a large Combine-built industrial factory called the Air Exchange. However, as development progressed, other environments seemed to create more interesting gameplay, and it was then replaced with Nova Prospect. Instead of the Air Exchange's industrial setting, Nova Prospect was a former prison where the Combine now treats humans like machine parts. Similar to how City 17 was designed, a standard human-built prison was first created, and the Combine tech was then imposed upon it. This map design process simulates a history of change and adaptation of the Nova Prospect environment, creating a believable final product. Photoshop was used extensively by the development team. They would use the image editing tool to layer in concept art of Combine technology over in-game screenshots, allowing them to try out different concepts without having to create and texture models and render them in-game.
Different players reacted in different ways once they were given control over the antlions. Some would treat them as pets, happily guiding them through Nova Prospect. Others enjoyed shoving them into combat and watching them get wasted by the Combine. The fact that some players made a connection with their antlions, despite the antlions' lack of a true face or dialogue, is quite remarkable, and can likely be credited to their animation and the gentle cooing sounds they make.
When creating an area, level designer Aaron Barber found it important to first become very familiar with the type of environment that he was attempting to create. This can be done by watching movies or documentaries, as well as studying architecture books and reference photos. He would start the design process by conceptualizing the level as a whole, creating an overall layout before focusing on the details of each individual area. Then he would work on the composition of each area, not worrying about textures or lighting. Finally, he would iteratively add in details, breaking the level down into a series of smaller issues until it was complete. This top-down approach ensured the level as a whole was cohesive, and it allows for large changes to be made before individual areas are polished.
When designing the Combine technology, the animators and artists at Valve worked together closely to create bridges, gates, and walls that had an interesting look, with highly detailed animations to match. One of the prime surviving examples is the Combine Wall, which advances through the city, destroying anything in its path.
The heads for all characters within Half-Life 2 are based on the heads of real people. Valve used individuals with striking looks, creating 3D models of their heads, and using photos of their faces as textures. Alex's face was based on Jamil Mullen, who was also her body model. She did the motion capture for many of Alex's basic animations, such as running and jumping, which took several days. As useful as motion capture is, data points from an actor's motions need to be translated into the existing 3D models, and adjustments need to be made to ensure that animations can loop seamlessly and flow into each other.
These prisoner pods were designed to intrigue the player. They are something seen throughout the game from the very beginning, but their real purpose isn't made clear until this point. Their design was finely tuned in order to spark curiosity within the player, allowing the player to form theories as to their use, without making the pod's purpose too obvious from the beginning.
When viewing a movie, every camera shot is predetermined, and as a consequence, each scene will be seen from the same angle every time. In the best movies, every shot is selected to clearly showcase the actors' performances, the set design, and the lighting. In Half-Life 2, however, the camera's position and angle are essentially complete unknowns to the developers. Therefore, the game's cinematic sequences have to be able to look good and be clear from every angle. This means that small and discrete dramatic movements are replaced with broad gestures. As one could imagine, this could sometimes lessen the dramatic pretext of the original performance. Lighting is an issue as well, because characters also have to be lit in a way that looks good from any angle. Sometimes the in-world lighting will work for this, but in other instances, invisible lights have to be suspended in space for the proper look to be achieved. While neither of these design decisions are optimal, trade-offs often have to be made in order to give complete control to the player at all times.
These Combine turret defense battles are a good way to provide a change of pace for the player. As the Half-Life games are almost always about advancing, segments like this provide a different experience, almost like a battle puzzle. Setting up the turrets in the correct locations, locating supplies, and knowing the layout of the area is important. This adds a layer of strategy unique to these segments. Many players don't know that they can carry these reprogrammed turrets from one battle to the next. While carrying the turrets can be cumbersome, the result is quite pleasing, and the sheer firepower can prevent the Combine soldiers from even entering the room during the final standoff.
Teleportation technology is central to the Half-Life series, and it was therefore important that the various teleports within the game be visually distinct from each other. Kleiner and Eli's teleports were small and appeared to be cobbled together using whatever materials they could get their hands on. The Combine's teleports, on the other hand, had a grandiose polish not found among the Resistance's tech, clearly displaying the Combine's limitless resources. It was important that teleports differed from each other, yet shared certain visual qualities. This implied that the same type of technology was being used in both teleports. Certain shared visual cues, such as the rounded raising platform, effectively conveyed this idea.
Doc, come in. Are you
Special attention was given to eyes when designing the game's characters. Human brains are hardwired to read eyes, so it was essential that they be spot on in order to be convincing. A real person's eyes are not spherical, so Half-Life 2's character models were designed the same way so that they'd glint properly when they rotate. It was also important to make sure that the characters would look at the player directly and correctly. Player reaction to these small details was very positive, making players more at ease and comfortable in the game world. Players said that the characters then seemed kinder, smarter, and more human. A substantial amount of time was devoted to something that may seem superfluous to the development of a first-person action game. However, getting these small details just right had a large payoff.
Dog is one of the few main characters in the game to not have any combat-based AI. All of his combat are very over-the-top and exciting, but are all self-contained, scripted, playing out the same way. That sounds disappointing. However, it's a nice trade-off as he is then able to hurl objects through the air, rip things apart, and generally wreak havoc in a way that no one else can.
Early in the game's development, there was to be an emphasis on mankind's servitude in combat. Large, nightmarish factories were prototyped, but lacked entertaining gameplay and were therefore cut. At one point in the game's development, children were to be found working in such factories. But it was later decided that the citizens' reproductive cycle had been repressed for too long for any children to be left, and their absence became a minor, albeit poignant theme within the game.
This particular area serves several purposes. First of all, it's a recognizable scene from the game's opening, yet it's currently in a far different state. This shows how much the city has changed in Gordon's absence. Secondly, the citizens tearing down the Breencast monitor clearly shows the player what he or she is fighting for. The rebels taking their time to do this while the battle still rages sends an important message to the Combine and the player that the citizens are fighting to take back City 17. Finally, it provides a nice, safe, and open area to teach the player squad command mechanics.
When designing the various civilians, it was important that each person in each group have its own individual look and personality. Civilians on the coast or in City 17 needed to look unique from the Resistance fighters. Since the player would be interacting with many citizen and Resistance NPCs at once, it was important that the player recognize them as individuals rather than virtual clones.
The gravity gun is a later version of the fizz gun, a weapon with a similar appearance that was first publicly shown in a demo at E3 2003, and was also included in an infamous playable Half-Life 2 leak. It actually functioned quite differently from the gravity gun, projecting a blue, somewhat wobbly beam that would grab objects and hold them in midair. The beam's length could be changed by the player to bring the object closer or put it farther, and it could be used to place objects with precision. If any of this sounds somewhat familiar, that's because it has a unique fate. Living On is an important tool in Gary's mod, a popular mod that creates a sandbox environment within the source engine and shares a lot of content with Half-Life 2.
Early in the game's development, Half-Life 2 is to have a much more Western style, most likely based in the United States. However, it was later decided that the game would be much more visually interesting with an Eastern setting. Eastern Europe has much more history, and it shows in its architecture. This collision of the old and the new created a more interesting contrast, and allowed the invasive Combine architecture to stand out more.
A theme, in essence, is an element that is repeated and is iterated upon many times in a work of art. This is exactly what Valve does when theming a level. A significant element is chosen, then repeated over and over throughout the level until it is clear what the level's theme is supposed to be. There are 3 sizes of objects within the game's world: large, medium, and tiny. First, each object is checked to make sure the level of detail is consistent, then the larger objects are placed into the world. These are objects like buildings and landmarks. Following that, smaller objects like trees and other ornaments are placed. Finally, trash and small decals like posters or graffiti are added, completing the level's look.
When creating the music for Half-Life 2, the game's composer, Kelly Bailey, created most of the music using computer software that simulated a sound studio. To start composing a song, he tried to think of a few words that describe the tone he wanted for the track. Phrases like fast action, suspense, quiet exploration, mystery, or slow, disturbing dark. As the track was iterated upon, it was important to continuously refer back to the original phrase, ensuring that the song would converge upon its intended feel.
Lack of specialization makes the Combine a force to be reckoned with. The Combine's long-term strategy is to conquer races by exploiting their weaknesses and to benefit from whatever strategies, technologies, or other advantages that were possessed by those races. Through doing this, the Combine has evolved into a military force so diverse that it's nearly impossible to oppose them. The civil protection officers and Combine soldiers are just a look at the beginning of the Combine's plan to implement humanity into their military.
When designing larger Combine enemies the player would combat, Valve didn't want the player to be fighting large generic robots or gigantic organic aliens. Instead, they wanted to blur the line between creature and machine. Instead of approaching this concept with flesh and blood creatures that have been recently fitted with weapons and armor, they instead opted to create alien species that had once been fully organic, but were conquered and forced by the Combine to evolve into war machines over time.
Since the Combine's technology was mostly composed of partially organic creatures, the animation and visual designs for much of their tech was inspired by various real-world animals. Striders, for example, are a combination of a giraffe and a gorilla. They have long, graceful legs, yet they lead with their shoulders and stomp as they walk to convey a simian power. In addition, the dropships have a body that strongly resembles that of a crab, and the Combine City Scanner's body and movement was based on a piranha.
Just as City 17 was designed to appear as if it had formed naturally, it was important to make it appear to have been destroyed naturally as well. To achieve this look, Valve would first design some low-detail buildings in Source's level editor, Hammer, then use graphic software Softimage XSI to destroy these buildings, and add in additional details like cracks and rebar.
The Citadel is certainly an imposing structure, but Valve's team also wanted to make everything about it invasive. The Combine walls surrounding it expand into the city, demolishing buildings as the Citadel itself digs into the ground, creating a giant chasm. This scene was originally going to feature citizens atop the cliffs above the player, attacking the Citadel and firing rockets at it. However, it was later decided that it'd be better to have the player be alone, and evoke the feeling of a lone knight entering the fortress of his enemy.
The gunship repair bay glimpsed here is actually the only surviving bits of a level that was originally planned for Nova Prospect. The original repair bay sequence actually went through a lot of playtesting before it was cut. The level was also to feature movable cranes that the player would control, and naked gunships with their armor removed. As the player left the area, soldiers and antlions were to enter, creating a raging battle that was to ignite fuel lines, engulfing everything in flames.
Today, many video games are far more than just games. They are experiences. While many still provide challenges, the challenge is not always the main focus. Today's games are about being immersed in the world, the narrative, the game's flow, and the sense of adventure. The longtime standard of a game becoming increasingly challenging as the game progresses is breaking down to a certain extent. Games are now more commonly designed to keep pace with the player's growing skill, instead of always being one step ahead of it. Half-Life 2 does do this for the most part. However, the game's difficulty doesn't peak at the end, it takes a dive. Instead of the Citadel being a harsh and grueling challenge, the gravity gun is supercharged, and this allows the player to plow through the Combine's last defenses. The Citadel is a very cold, soulless, and imposing place. And while it certainly keeps players on edge, the player's journey through the Citadel is more of a reward than a challenge.
DirectX 9 was the newest version of Microsoft's multimedia-based application programming interface at the time of Half-Life 2's release, and with it came more tools than ever before for shaders. A shader is a program that dictates how something is drawn by a computer, and in modern games it's closely related to how surfaces are affected by light. As Half-Life 2 features many different materials which react to light in many different ways, shaders were important to Half-Life 2. One particularly important use was the emulation of specular reflectivity for the rendering of glossy surfaces such as metal and plastic. Valve did thorough research in order to get the reflectivity and specularity exactly right for the different materials in order to have a very specific material library. Instead of having reflections generated in real time, which was very resource consuming in 2004, a 360-degree render of an area is generated for several different points in each map. These renders are referred to as cube maps, and these static 360-degree images are what you will see reflected off of objects and surfaces while in-game.
Bump mapping is a method of adding the appearance of depth to a texture without having to render extra polygons in the game. It allows texture artists to determine how light hits a texture, creating the appearance of ripples, creases, or bumps on an otherwise smooth surface. This gives it a less flat appearance. Most of the bump maps for Half-Life 2 were made within a month, and were created using a polygonal render of the texture's surface.
Some of the earliest concepts of the Citadel's exterior depicted it as a mixture of European and alien architecture. While this approach was abandoned for the exterior, the interior was based on the totalitarian architecture of Nazi and communist regimes. What makes the Citadel distinctly different, however, is a lack of symmetry, which is intended to create tension.
The concept of the stalkers started out with creatures that would follow the player in the shadows and then jump out. This idea wasn't really the final application for the stalkers, but they became even more horrifying as their visual design was worked out. They became captured humans who were gutted, amputated, weaponized, crazed, and mentally unstable slave laborers for the Combine. While they are technically enemies of the player, the fact that they are also victims made players pity them, creating a sense of moral ambiguity. This made them much more horrifying than the typical monster.
With the unexpected success of Half-Life 1, Valve had a huge act to follow, and needed to live up to or exceed the outrageously high expectations set for them by themselves and the gaming public. When production eventually started on Half-Life 2, Valve's co-founder, Gabe Newell, told the team that they need not worry about how much time or money was spent creating the game. The only thing they had to be concerned with was making it the best game of all time. Whether or not they achieved this is up for debate. However, something that cannot be denied is the huge impact that Half-Life 2 had on the gaming industry and its legions of fans.
When working on this project, I really wanted to make sure that, no matter what I did, the update still felt like an authentic version of Half-Life 2. The first goal was fixing many of the bugs and glitches that have plagued the game and worsened the player experience for years. Community input at this step was essential, and with their help, I was able to fix many more problems that I had initially known about. Some of my fixes were eventually incorporated in the official Half-Life 2 updates. The most tedious part by far, however, was the visual overhaul, making sure every shadow and every light was appropriately sharp, fog blended nicely with the environment, and that each area colors were pleasing and matched the game's tone was a long process. The changes needed to be notable, but not to change the soul of Half-Life 2, almost as if it were an official redetailing by Valve. This balancing of new effects, details, and carefully crafted adjustments with the game's original assets was the key element and took up much of the update's development time. I'd like to give a big thank you to Origin PC, EVGA, and Nvidia for their sponsorship, Ross Scott and Did You Know Gaming for helping us read this commentary, and of course Valve for the amazing support. But most of all, I want to thank the passionate fans that have given me a reason to create this. I hope it was worth the wait. Thanks.
In the meantime, this is where I get off.
Lamar? Lamar! Blast that little... Where did she get to?